Hello there everyone, Matt here with thevirtualinstructor.com, and in this video I'd like to share with you a time lapse that was taken from one of our new courses. The new course is called Realistic Pencil Drawing. Now, of course, in the course, this presentation, this lesson is presented in real time, of course, but we're going to take a look at a time lapse so you can see the entire process from start to finish. Now, in this course, Realistic Pencil Drawing, of course, we take a look at the techniques and secrets that artists use to create realistic pencil drawings. Now, of course, this course is part of our membership program, which includes a variety of drawing and painting courses on a variety of subjects and media. Also, weekly live lessons, which are all recorded and stored in our vault of lessons. Weekly critiques, which are part of the Members Minute, and a year-long curriculum for visual arts teachers. If you want to learn more about our membership program, I'll leave a link in the description below. You can check it out. And also, I'll leave a link to the new course, Realistic Pencil Drawing. So if you want to just check out that course, you can do so as well. Now, with that being said, I almost forgot. I'm going to give away a free year-long membership to one of you guys. Now, to learn how you can get this membership, you'll have to stick around to the end of the video and I'll tell you what you need to do to be considered. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and get into the time lapse. There are, of course, several different techniques we can use to ensure accuracy in our drawings, and one of those techniques I like to refer to as the grid technique. And I like to use the grid technique whenever I am drawing a subject that requires a lot of accuracy. Of course, this would apply to portraits, for example, but also to very precise objects like this car here. And this is a Porsche that we're drawing here, and we're using the grid technique to make sure that we get as accurate as a depiction of the subject on the drawing paper as possible without using a technique like a graphite transfer or something like that. So the way the grid technique works is we create a grid on our photo reference, and in this case I created a grid using Photoshop over the top of my photo reference. Then I created a proportional grid on the drawing paper, so we have the same number of squares in the photo reference and the same number of squares on the drawing surface. Then it's simply a process of drawing what information we see in each square in our photo reference onto the corresponding square on the drawing surface. Now here I'm starting with just the contour line. So I'm just focusing on drawing lines where I see a contrast in value. Then once our contour line drawing is in place, that's when I went back and started developing the values and in turn all of the different textures within the scene. Now the best way to think about drawing with the grid technique is to think about each individual square as being its own individual drawing. So what that will do is it will force your mind from thinking, hey, we're drawing a car here, or in this case, we're drawing a tire, and instead focus on the lines, shapes, and values that you actually see in each square. So it basically forces you to turn off your left brain and allows your right brain to take over, which is really what portion of the brain we need to be using when we're creating a drawing, because we see the world as a collection of shapes, lines, values, textures, and so on, and it's just really our minds that make sense of that information. So we really see the world as an abstract way, or in an abstract way. And if we can recreate what we see in reality in a drawing, then we're going to have a representational or a realistic appearance. Now, in this particular case, I decided to start in the upper left-hand corner, developing the values and the textures, and then I progressively worked my way to the right side in the lower portion of the picture plane. Now, it may seem obvious the reason why I'm doing this, but I'm trying to make sure that I don't smear any graphite applications that I already have in place since I'm right-handed. The palm of your hand definitely can creep in and destroy areas that you have worked so hard on during the drawing process. So it's always a good idea to kind of think about how you're going to approach the drawing. Now, this is different depending on the medium that I'm using, but in this particular case, of course, I'm using graphite, and graphite can smear if you're not careful. Now, an added precaution that I'm taking here is I've got a paper towel underneath the palm of my hand. This will clearly prevent the palm of my hand from making contact with the surface of the paper, but the paper towel is not going to smear like the palm of your hand will, because your palm of your hand, of course, has oils in it, and those oils mix with the graphite and really can lead to a mess in your drawing if you're not careful. Now, As I'm filling up each square of the drawing here, I'm still keeping that same mindset that I had when I created the contour line drawing. So I'm focusing in on the shapes of value that I see here and applying mostly just HB graphite at this point. So you can see the drawing does look dark in areas, but that's just by adjusting the amount of pressure that I'm placing on the pencil. And since this is the only value information that we have on the surface, it's going to appear pretty dark at this point. But when we start applying the values on the car itself, these values are actually going to appear much lighter in comparison because value is relative. Now, as I work my way down to some of the areas that were a little bit closer to the viewer, there's quite a bit more detail in this location. So I've switched over to a 2H graphite before making the values a little bit darker. So we're going to see a little bit more of a broader range of value as we work closer to the viewer. We're also going to see additional contrast in this area, or at least contrast in value. So our dark's going to be a little bit darker as we work forward. But since we're seeing a little bit more detail, it's always a good idea to kind of start with lighter applications and then progressively build up darker applications. It's always easier to make an area darker in value than it is to have to go back and make a value a little bit lighter if we accidentally make it too dark. So when it comes to developing values and textures, I work a little bit more conservatively and then progressively make the values a little bit darker. So as you can see, I worked all the way down to the bottom portion of the picture plane on the left side, and then I went back up to the top of the picture plane, again trying to keep the palm of my hand out of the way. Now you'll also notice that I'm using a blending stomp every once in a while, and partly this is due to the fact that we're working on Stonehenge paper here. This paper has a heavier tooth. It's not super heavy like cold pressed watercolor paper, but it is a tooth or texture of the paper that will allow for multiple layered applications, which is something that we really want here when we're doing a complex drawing here with graphite. And the blending stump, of course, smooths out some of the texture that's produced by the paper. You can see this when I apply a softer graphite pencil, and you can see some of that graininess. But then when we go back with the blending stump, that smooths out some of that graininess. And since we have a variety of textures in this particular scene, we really don't want the texture of the paper influencing the surface textures that we're trying to create in the drawing. And that's why I'm using a blending stump here and there. You can see just in this little section here where we have the wooded background, we have the shiny metallic surface of the car, and then the transparency of the light. There's lots of different textures happening there. So we really have to use a variety of different techniques to capture all those different textures. And speaking of texture, the key to creating texture is basically twofold. Of course, the directional strokes that you make on the surface are going to be very important. So we want to make sure that these directional strokes make sense with the texture that we're trying to capture. We can see this in this particular case with that slightly grassy hill just to the left of the front edge of the car, and we can see how the directional strokes there lead to the illusion of texture. Now, on the car itself, we don't really have a lot of defined coarser textures where we're going to see those directional strokes. We're still going to consider those directional strokes as we work through the drawing, but really it's more about the relationship of the values. So whenever we have dark values and light values that are positioned next to each other, that's where we're going to really create the illusion of texture. So value, of course, is dependent on the directional strokes that we make, but it's also dependent on the relationship of the values. So that's one of the reasons why value is so incredibly important in drawings and paintings, because it influences so many other factors, so many other elements of art. So we create the illusion of form, of course, by the positioning of our values, and we also create the illusion of texture by the positioning of our values. And we can also create the illusion of space, actually. So this area that's further behind the car, it's going to eventually appear lighter in value than the areas that are closer to the viewer. So value, of course, is incredibly important. You can see here, as we get a little bit of a peek of some of the areas that are further away, they're much lighter in value. Now, after I go through some of these areas with the HB graphite and make them darker, you'll notice that I'm going back through again with the 2H graphite. And that, of course, helps to fill in some of the tooth of the texture of the paper as well. So that gives me a little bit more control over the texture that's produced by the surface of the paper as well. So you don't have to necessarily just use the blending stump everywhere. Of course, you can adjust the amount of pressure that you put on the pencil, and also consider all of the different grades of graphite that you have at your disposal as well. And don't just feel like you have to work darker all the time. You can always backtrack and use some of those lighter pencils that of course have harder graphite in them to fill in some of the tooth or texture of the paper. Now, of course, as you can see, as we work down to the section that's behind the glass, these values are going to be a little bit muted. So we're going to heavily use the blending stump here and make sure that we have strong contrast between the glass areas, or the areas behind the glass, and the areas in front of the glass. You can kind of see this on the roof of the car where we've got strong contrast there, but just underneath it where we're looking through the glass, there's a little bit less contrast, and those colors, or those values, I should say, are actually a little bit muted. Now, of course, I should speak about the tool that I'm using to actually apply the graphite to the surface. Of course, I have spoken several times about changing the grade of your graphite, working from 2H, 2B, HB, and so on, but the pencil looks exactly the same, and that's because this is a lead holder that I'm using, and this is made by a company called Steeler, and you can purchase individual grades of graphite and then switch those grades of graphite in and out of the lead holder. I absolutely love using the lead holder. Of course, the harder graphite pencils, the H pencils, are going to make lighter marks, and the B pencils are going to make darker marks because, of course, they have softer graphite. Now, at this point, we've moved on down to the hood of the car, and this is where we're seeing all types of different reflections. Just keep in mind when you encounter reflections in a drawing that a reflection is just that. It is basically the values that you see around the car, or in this case, a car, or around the subject, reflected. And this is, of course, in this particular case, the reflection is coming from the trees around it, but that reflection is usually going to be distorted based on the shape of the object. And you can see that this reflection, of course, is distorted. But here again, this can be overwhelming, but if we just focus on the shapes of value that we observe and we concentrate on placing those shapes of value in the appropriate place in our drawing, then we're going to create the appropriate illusion, of course. Now, in this process, you can see that I'm using the eraser. I'm using various different grades of graphite. I went pretty dark here with the 4B graphite, and then went back again with the 2H graphite, filling in some of the tooth of the paper to make a smoother appearance. And then from there, it's time to work down to the front of the car, again, following the same techniques that we've used throughout the process. I'm starting with lighter applications with the 2H graphite, just getting some graphite in place, and then of course using the blending stump to work that in before switching over to a softer graphite like an HB or a 2B to progressively and slowly build up the darker values. Now, of course, I've mentioned before that one of the reasons why you want to slowly build up the darker values is, of course, you don't want to go too dark too quickly because it's hard to reverse that. You can reverse it, it's just a little bit more difficult to do that. But there's a second reason why you want to slowly build up the darkness of value with the graphite, and that's due to a phenomenon, we'll call it graphite shine. Now, graphite shine, graphite of course is inherently a shiny medium, but perhaps you worked on a graphite drawing before and you've noticed it got really shiny, and that's because graphite drawings can be very shiny. Now, of course, we can do some things to make sure that our drawing is not as shiny as it might be, and this all actually deals with the surface, the paper that we're working on. Graphite is at its shininess when the surface that you're working on is super smooth. So what happens a lot of times is people will grab a really dark graphite pencil and push really hard on it when they're trying to address a dark area. They'll put all the pressure that they can muster on that pencil. And what happens is it flattens the tooth or texture of the paper. And when that tooth or texture of the paper is flattened, then that shine is enhanced. It makes the drawing really, really shiny. So the key to kind of avoiding that is just to slowly build up your applications and not put too much pressure on the pencil so that you're flattening the tooth of the paper. And of course, that will help your drawing look less shiny. Your graphite drawings look less shiny. Now, while I've been talking about Graphite Shine, we've worked down to the front of the car, and here again, you can see those reflections and how they really just bring the drawing to life. And again, it's just a process of recognizing what you see in your reference or in your subject, and then putting that information in your drawing. And I know that sounds simple, and it's a little bit harder to do that in reality, but if you just keep that in mind, that you're just basically replicating what you see to the best of your ability, then you're going to have better luck with your drawings. Don't try to draw a car, for example, in this particular case. Try to draw the values that you see on that car instead, and that is usually what will lead to a more realistic image. Now you'll notice here, down here on the bottom lower part of the car, we've got lots of dark values, and it's really easy to get lost in those dark values, especially when there's just subtle changes between one dark value and another dark value, as we see on the grill there. But if you just take each section one at a time and work slowly, and make comparisons, of course, make comparisons to the values that you're adding in one location and compare it to another location in the drawing, ensuring that you have a full range, meaning you have the darkest darks and the lightest lights, then you're going to end up with a realistic image, of course. And one thing that might be helpful is to actually use a value scale. So it's really easy to make a value scale. You can make a value scale with 7 or 8 or 9 values, and you just make the darkest values that you can make with a pencil on one end of the value scale, and then of course on the other end of the value scale it's as light as it gets, and then you put all of the different values in between. You can use this value scale to make comparisons on your subject, like your photo reference or your actual subject that you're drawing from reality, of course. And when you can locate the values that you're actually seeing on the value scale and incorporate them in your drawing, then you're going to see a huge difference in the drawings that you create. A lot of times new artists or beginners with drawing have a tendency to not get that full range of value, and a lot of times their drawings end up being a little bit light, and sometimes it's hard to really build up those guts necessary to make some of those darker values. But of course, if you're just accurate with your depiction of the values, then that goes a long way in creating a representational drawing, of course. Now, one thing that you'll also have noticed at this point is I'm using several different erasers throughout this process, and the eraser is definitely a mark-making tool. The eraser can be used to erase out highlights. It can also be used, of course, to make different areas of the drawing a little bit lighter. Now, I'm using a couple of vinyl erasers. These are the white erasers that you see, and one of those vinyl erasers is actually an electric eraser. This allows me to go in and erase in areas where a lot of graphite has been applied to the surface, and that electric eraser is the big thick black one that you will see making an appearance every once in a while. I also have a handheld vinyl eraser that's smaller and works a little bit more like a pencil, but of course it's not quite as strong as the electric eraser. And then a third eraser that I'm using is a kneaded eraser. Now, we're not seeing the kneaded eraser too much at this point, but a kneaded eraser is great for basically lifting up graphite so you can make an area lighter in value without affecting the texture. If you've ever used like a pink pearl eraser or even a vinyl eraser, sometimes it can smear the graphite on the surface when you really just want it to be a little bit lighter, and that's where a kneaded eraser comes in, of course. And of course, the electric eraser was definitely handy in making a little bit of an alteration there to the front hood that you might have noticed. There was a mistake in the initial drawing which needed to be changed, and I didn't really notice it until I started working on the right side of the car. So that's why it's really important to be making comparisons between one section of the drawing to the rest throughout the process. A lot of times we kind of get focused on one little area of the drawing, and it's not until we step back and look at the big picture that we really notice those little mistakes that happen in our drawings. So always be taking breaks and taking a step back and looking at take a look at what you've got in your drawing, and make sure all of the different sections of the drawing make sense with all of the other sections of the drawing, of course, even if you use a technique like the grid technique to ensure accuracy. So you can see here on the right side of the car, we're getting some really strong reflections, and the stronger the reflection, the higher the contrast that we're going to see here. So we really can't make out exactly what those elements are that are reflected, but of course that's not important. What's important is the relationships of the values there. And in this particular case, since this side of the car is facing the light source, we have really strong contrast here and some really strong reflections. I also want to point out how long this drawing took. I think that it is a misconception, especially by a lot of beginner artists, that drawings can be created in a very short period of time, and they mistakenly believe that artists who create drawings that are realistic are somehow talented and they're just able to whip these things out in a short period of time. And that's just couldn't be further from the truth. I think we're conditioned to believe that kind of stuff, especially with YouTube videos like this one that are time-lapse, and we're seeing the whole process in a matter of a few minutes. And really, that's not very realistic. This drawing, for example, took over 25 hours to complete. So there's no way I could have completed this drawing in even a whole day because it took over 24 hours to create this drawing. And I think it's a big aha moment for a lot of people when they realize, hey, I just need to slow down. And if I slow down, I can create a drawing like this too. And that is totally the truth. A lot of times you just need to slow down and take your time and really pay attention to what you're seeing and be willing to put in the time that it takes to create a realistic drawing. Some people might argue, I just don't have the patience for that. Well, that's a skill that you have to learn like everything else. And creating representational drawings does require an element of patience. And for some of you, you're going to have to practice your patience. For some of you, it's going to come relatively easily. But yeah, we want to get to the end of that drawing and see what it looks like as quickly as possible. But the patience that is required here definitely pays off in the end when your drawing's complete and you're really proud of what you've created. And you also have to recognize that you're creating an artifact. This is something, the drawings and paintings that you create, hopefully will stay around much longer than you will. And of course, it's going to be evidence that you existed and that you created something wonderful in the world. So take your time, work slowly, and enjoy the process. And here's a look at our final result here of the drawing. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you were able to pick up a couple of things here and there. Remember, if you're new to the channel or if you haven't done so yet, why not subscribe? We cover a broad variety of drawing and painting media and subject matter here. Click on that subscribe button and click on that notification bell so you're notified every time we upload a new video here on YouTube. We upload on a broad variety of drawing and painting media and subject matter as well. Now, if you want to check out 3 of our course videos and ebooks for free, you can do so. There's a link in the description below. All you have to do is click on that link. It'll take you to another page where you enter your email address, and then instantaneously you'll have access to 3 of our course videos and ebooks for free. And again, if you want to check out our membership program, which includes courses, weekly live lessons, weekly critiques, and a year-long curriculum for visual arts teachers, there's a link in the description below. Everyone starts off with a week-long trial for 7 days. 7 days completely free, so you can see if the program's right for you. And as I mentioned before, I'm going to give away a free membership to one of you guys for an entire year. All you have to do to be considered is enter in the comments below what type of car you would like to learn how to draw in graphite. In a few weeks, I'll choose one of those comments at random, and that person will get a year-long membership for free at thevirtualinstructor.com. Thanks again for watching, and as always, I wish you all the very best in your artistic success.